All right, welcome everyone. This is Re-Education, an anti-communist introduction to the far left. My name is Karlyn Borysenko. For those of you who might be new to me, I'm an industrial organizational psychologist who has gone on a little bit of a journey to become an investigative journalist and an undercover journalist following the radical revolutionary far left in America. Now, why is that important that I'm an industrial organizational psychologist? Well, I do think that one of the things that I bring to the far left that a lot of people that are analyzing the left don't bring is I understand how to analyze social systems. I understand how to analyze group dynamics. I was one of those people that would go into organizations and do training about corporate communication and team building and things like that. I've analyzed a lot of teams at a very high level to understand the psychological dynamics of the team. And so that is very well applied to the far left in a way that I don't think many people are doing, because I don't look at the far left and just go, these are a crazy bunch of kooks. I don't look at the far left and call them mentally ill, because quite frankly, they're not. I know people don't like to hear that, but that is the truth. I don't look at the far left and instantly scream narcissist. And by the way, I studied narcissism in the workplace and workplace bullying for about 10 years. And so if anyone was going to be screaming narcissist about the left, it probably would be me, but I'm not, because the real far left is actually much more complicated than that. And the advantage of looking at work like I'm trying to do it and engaging in this type of analysis is that I do tend to take a much more nuanced approach to how I analyze the group. And I'm doing this based on 4 years, over 4 years now, going undercover inside their networks, inside their subcultures. I have watched probably at least 5,000 hours of video of far left training and activism and education and events over the last several years. I don't work based off of clickbait content that's taken out of context that makes its way around the internet or that usually makes its way onto the news media. I work based on what do the full trainings say? What does the full scope of evidence say? I analyze information across many different groups on the far left. And so I believe the analysis that I've developed about the far left that we're dealing with in the country right now is unique. I think it's the most robust analysis on the market. And what we're going to be doing here today is I'm going to be walking you through just some of my experiences with the far left, and I'm going to articulate to you, assuming that everyone here is kind of a beginner, and maybe you might have some notion that communists and socialists do exist in America because you've seen people on Fox News or you've seen Donald Trump talk about it. I'm going to bring you inside the real far left, and I'm going to show you what's actually going on. My position on this is that I do believe the far left is a very big problem, and I believe it's a bigger problem than most people understand, because I don't think that people are looking past the surface level of what's going on the far left a lot of the times. They're not going into their meetings, they're not listening to how they're organizing. And when I've been doing these things, one thing jumps out at me every single time, which is it is terrifying how organized they are. It is terrifying how focused they are. It is terrifying how many events they have, what they're actually teaching each other. These are things that you never see on the mainstream media. These are things that you never see anti-communists actually cover. And we go into them. I go undercover in person, but we also do deep dives into the far left on my channel almost every single day during the week. And so I hope this piques people's appetite for people who are new to the far left and socialism. I'm going to give you a little taste today of what you need to know about the far left to understand their language. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of my experiences. And just to make sure people know my bona fides, because again, there might be a lot of new people watching this, I have actually gone undercover with the far left in person multiple times. I'm going to show you a couple examples of those. The first time I ever went undercover with the far left, it was at a conference called the Collective Power Conference at Hampshire College in Western Massachusetts. And basically, this was a far left socialist reproductive justice conference. What you're seeing here are actually photos that I took at the conference inside an abortion tour, where they taught me how to have a self-managed abortion, bleed my unborn child into a toilet with the help of an abortion doula. And then at the end, I got to go and worship at the actual abortion shrine. Sometimes, you hear right wingers talk about how the left worships at the altar of abortion. Well, guess what? I've actually seen an abortion shrine. I've seen it in person. This was my first ever experience. And the question I got asked when I went undercover at this event was, Karlyn, was the shrine about worshiping the soul of the baby? And I had to say no, because if you look closely at some of the elements on the shrine, and you can see in this image here on the right, there is actually an image of like a person with, it looks like her hands over her eyes. And what it says on the outside of that image, it's very, very small. I bet you guys can't see it, but what it says on the outside of this plate is, "Loving yourself is the greatest revolution." So that was my first ever experience undercover with the far left. I have to say, I am a pro-choice individual personally, but I have to say this almost made me pro-life because of how blatant and how aggressive the left was about abortion, how they really have no, it doesn't seem like they have any semblance of humanity, and abortion and reproductive justice is at the focal point of their strategies around abolishing the gender binary, which we are going to get into a little bit later. Well, that wasn't enough for me, and several months after that, I decided to go undercover at the biggest far left event of the year, and that is the Socialism Conference. Now, for those of you who are new, obviously this recording is happening in July 2025, but where we've actually just finished covering the 2025 Socialism Conference. So if you missed that over on my YouTube channel, we actually did 3 full days of coverage of the Socialism Conference. The Socialism Conference is one of the biggest far left activist events of the year. Far left socialists from all over the country fly into Chicago, and they basically spend several days meeting with each other and planning and organizing and stuff like that. I went undercover at the event 2 years ago. And, you know, when you're in undercover at socialist events, they do make you wear a mask. I did have to wear a disguise. I even wore a chest binder. I got brand new glasses for the occasion, because apparently the only thing that you have to do to make sure people don't recognize you in the real world, if you have a YouTube channel on the internet, is just get a different pair of glasses and no one knows who you are. It is actually a pro tip. It does actually work, which is crazy in and of itself. But I want to share with you, just to give you an idea of some of the things that come out when I go undercover at these events. I want to share with you a couple of recordings that I took just with a little USB stick in my pocket. And the first recording is of the then president of the American Library Association. Her name was Emily Drabinski. She is no longer the president of the American Library Association. She has now been seceded by other non-binary people. The American Library Association is basically the professional organization for all librarians across the country. And Emily is a confessed Marxist, and she went around saying right after she got elected to be the head of the American Library Association that she couldn't believe a Marxist lesbian had, you know, been elected to this role and everything. Well, I happened to run into Emily at the Socialism 2023 conference. It was actually a little bit of an accident. And what happened was, I was in a session listening to other people talk, and Emily came up to the microphone during the Q&A session. And I want to play you just a recording of what Emily said. Now, it is a little bit hard to hear because this was on a USB device in my pocket, but you will be able to see the words on the screen. Let me just play this video real quick.
So this camera will be followed by the camera in the green, followed by the camera here.
Hi, I'm Emily, and I'm a librarian. I just want to say thank you so much. I just want to say thank you for bringing up libraries and classroom libraries, but also school libraries of all kinds, public libraries and higher education libraries who have been under attack in similar ways. But I think your point that public education needs to be a side of socialist organizing, I think libraries really do too. And that I haven't seen that for the people that are working in libraries, but I think there's real opportunity here to both connect what's happening in public education, what's happening in libraries, but also we need some help in the libraries. We need to be on the agenda of socialist organizing.
So libraries need to be on the agenda of socialist organizing, from the then president of the American Library Association. Emily wasn't the only person I ran into at the Socialism Conference. I also ran into a guy named Jesse Hagopian. Jesse Hagopian is one of our favorite teacher educators, and we follow him all the time. And here's what Jesse Hagopian had to say. We'll play his video next.
All right. Thank you, everybody. I'm Jesse Hagopian. I'm a teacher in Seattle, and I work with Black Lives Matter at School and the Zen Education Project and Rethinking Schools. So I've actually got to Zoom in and do meetings with classrooms in Florida and with some bold teachers who invited us into the classroom in the tradition of fugitive pedagogy, and smuggling in contraband curriculum. showing the film, The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks, and then having us come and discuss systemic racism in a state where it's illegal. And so that rebellion is inspiring to me, and telling teachers in my state to do this work, if they can do it in those conditions.
So what you heard Jesse Hagopian saying just then was essentially Jesse Hagopian is a high school teacher in Seattle, or he was a high school teacher in Seattle. He seems to be a full-time socialist teacher activist now, but at the time he was a high school teacher in Seattle, and what was going on was teachers in Florida, where you might think woke curriculum is banned because that's what Ron DeSantis tells you, but there were teachers in Florida working with Jesse Hagopian to actually Zoom Jesse into their classrooms and have Jesse teach the curriculum that was banned in Florida. So the teachers had plausible deniability to say, oh no, it's not us that's teaching it. We're not teaching these things. But they were Zooming in someone from across the country to teach the materials that they couldn't teach. This is called fugitive pedagogy or smuggler pedagogy. And this was talked about openly at socialist events that I went undercover at. Another event that I went undercover at was at the University of Colorado at Boulder. And this was a really crazy event because this was an event where I went to a presentation about how dissociative disorder, or some people might know this colloquially as multiple personality disorder, they did a whole presentation about how dissociative disorder is a literal gender identity. It's called system gender, in which you have multiple beings or entities inside of you, and they all have different genders, and apparently they all have different gender therapists as well. And that person was the system gendered person presenting at the conference. You might think that looks like one person, but that was actually two different people in the presentation. So two different of the alt identities actually presented this presentation, so they switched back and forth between them. There were a lot of people with multiple personality disorder in the room with me. I basically felt like I was surrounded. It was a very interesting experience. This was, of course, all taxpayer funded at the University of Colorado. But the good news is that a week after I showed this presentation to the world, because I recorded the whole presentation, you can actually find it on my Substack, you can find it on my YouTube channel. The University of Colorado decided to dissociate from this particular conference. It was called the Transforming Gender Conference after this. So I guess that was a little bit of win for the undercover work, but that was definitely a crazy event. And what I want people to know about this is events like this are not unusual. Events like this happen all over the country all the time. And we are actually very lucky in that most of the time, I don't even have to get on a plane and fly to these events, because the vast majority of the events that we go undercover at, or I'll use undercover rather colloquially, they're actually just virtual events, because it makes sense for the left to use the internet to organize. It's cheaper, it's more effective, you can reach more people, you can do events over and over and over again, you can have as many people as you want in a room, you don't have to pay rental fees, you don't have to organize, food and drink and coffee and all that stuff that you might have to do with an in-person event. So the vast majority of leftist organizing actually does take place online to a really great degree. Now, that doesn't mean they don't do things in the real world. Of course, we see things like the Zoran Mandami campaign in New York City. They're out knocking on doors and making phone calls, just like any other political campaign does. In fact, they're knocking on a lot of doors and making a lot of phone calls. So I don't want to make it seem like the left doesn't do anything in the real world. They do a lot of things in the real world, and certainly those are events we want to cover. But in terms of understanding what the left believes, in terms of understanding what they're doing, how they think, how they operate, how they're communicating with each other, how they're organizing, we have access to so much information on the internet. We have access to more information than we can ever watch. And so most of the work that I do is just spent watching the presentations, listening to the language they're using, listening to the tactics they're talking about using, because when the left puts presentations online, they're not doing it to market to a mass audience. They're doing it to communicate with each other. But people like us that are vehemently against what the left is trying to do, we can watch those presentations and we can learn from those presentations, and we can use that to try to get ahead of the left or outsmart them, or try to basically throw sand in their gears so that they at least are slowed down a little bit. I do believe the left is winning. People don't like to hear this, but I absolutely believe the left is winning. I believe they're winning big time. I believe it's not even close. And if we don't get smart about how we're fighting them and how we're learning about them, I don't think that we actually have a chance. So what I want to go over today is I want to give you some high-level information that you need to know, and we're going to watch some clips and stuff as well, but I want to give you some high-level information if you are brand new to following the left with me. You're going to need to unlearn everything you think you know. And we're going to go back to the beginning because there is so much disinformation out there that is simply unhinged from what the real far left is doing in the real world. So, the very first thing I want people to understand is, what are the goals of the left? What is the left actually trying to do? Well, there are four things that the left is always trying to do. And every single tactic that you see the left doing in the real world, from protesting to organizing to yelling in the streets to taking over public schools to taking over media to propaganda, every single thing that you see the left doing in the real world does come back to one or more of these four goals at all times. They are: gain as much power as possible, destabilize the system, attack capitalism, usher in their Marxist utopia. That is what they're doing. That is what they're doing at all times. There is nothing that the left does that does not meet one or more of those four goals. So let me go through those quickly, and then we're going to dig into the main one that we want to pay attention to today, which is goal number 3: attacking capitalism. So the left starts out by trying to gain as much power as possible. Essentially, the far left in America has been here for about 100 years, a little bit before that, but really kind of the start of the far left takeover of America happened in the 1930s when the Frankfurt School came over from Columbia University, a group of mostly Jewish intellectuals, and then set up shop at Columbia. Yeah, they came over from Germany. They set up shop at Columbia University in the 1930s. They came over much stronger after World War II. There were more people that came over and joined them. And essentially, this is why Columbia is like the home base for all of the encampment protests that you see, for all of the social justice protests that you see. Columbia is always very prominent because Columbia is very literally the epicenter of the left, and it has been for about 100 years. Once they took over Columbia, they started kind of branching out and taking over other higher education institutions as well, of course, starting with the Ivy League schools and then trickling down into, your lesser private schools and your state funded schools and all that. Currently, the left pretty much controls the academic side of higher education. They are the faculty. There are very few faculty members across all colleges and universities, with rare exception, that are not radical leftists. So what was the Frankfurt School trying to do? What were they trying to do by taking over the university systems? They were trying to gain as much power as possible by putting themselves into positions of institutional power that they could not be fired from. It is very important that people understand the difference between institutional power and political power, because people think that you gain power by winning elections. And sure, you do gain some power by winning elections, but political power is fleeting in that you have to keep winning elections to keep maintaining that political power. You can be replaced literally at any given time, and you're always at the whim of what the voters want you to do, which Trump is finding out right now may or may not be aligned with what you actually want to do as a leader. So positions of political power are fine, but what the left understands is that you have to gain positions of institutional power to have long-term impact. Because when you get into a faculty role, especially a tenured faculty role at a university, it is very difficult to get fired from that role. Once you get a teaching job at a public school, it is very difficult to get fired from that role. Once you get a government job, as Trump is, has been finding out, it is very difficult to get fired from a government job, even if you're not even doing anything. So what the left does is they get themselves into these positions of institutional power across all major institutions, and then they just own that position. That gives them power to make decisions within the realm of that institution. So once they have that power, what do they do then? Then they work on destabilizing the system. So they make decisions and they enact policies that are fundamentally detrimental to the American dream, to what we're trying to accomplish, to even just being a functional country. People often look at the left and they say, why are they causing so much chaos? Why does it seem like they always veer towards chaos? Chaos is the goal. Destabilization is the goal. ultimately, what the far left wants to do is they do want to have a revolution in this country. They want to overthrow the federal government. They want to abolish the Constitution. They believe the federal government and the Constitution are capitalist documents. You're going to be hearing the word capitalism a lot tonight. And because they are capitalist documents and capitalist institutions, you need to abolish them to get where they want to go. And so they don't see destabilization as a bad thing. They in fact see destabilization as a feature of what they're actually trying to achieve, because you cannot overthrow the current system unless you fully destabilize it. Once they cause destabilization, what happens? Average people start experiencing pain. People don't like running into protests. They don't like having the roads blocked by the protests. They don't like, riots and setting fires to things. They don't like that people are shouting in the streets. They don't like that, inflation. They don't like DEI training. They don't like any of these things. The left starts to cause people pain until people start saying, hey, you know what? Things really suck. The Zoran Mandami campaign in New York City, by the way, is doing an amazing job of exploiting this pain to get people to vote for socialists, like literal socialists. What they're doing is they're saying, listen, things really suck right now. Do you know why they suck? Capitalism. Moving into goal number 3. Do you know why things are so bad? It's not because we got in and took over institutions and then just started screwing everything up and destabilizing everything. Things are so bad because of capitalism, because capitalism causes all of our problems. Capitalism is causing all your pain. And you know what we need to do? We need to get rid of capitalism and replace it with something else. And that something else, of course, is the Marxist utopia. So those are the 4 goals that the left is working on at all times. And you might say, Karlyn, what about this? What about that? What about that other thing? No. These are the 4 things that they're trying to do at all times. And every single tactic the left does achieves one or more of these 4 goals. So again, this is gain as much power as possible, destabilize the system, attack capitalism, usher in their Marxist utopia. And capitalism is always the target. This is a meme that went around Twitter. And actually, I have to give Reagan a shout out. Reagan's in the chat. This meme actually didn't originally look like this, because this meme actually used to have Palestine at the center of the issue. However, when we saw this meme, we were like, "Oh no. You've got it messed up a little bit." And Reagan actually took the time to make the meme more accurate. So if you've seen this meme running around Twitter where Palestine is at the center of it, that's not accurate. They're so close. Some people are so close, but what we're really going to talk a lot about tonight is how capitalism bleeds into everything. And this is the piece that most people don't understand. When we're talking about racism, that's a function of capitalism. When we're talking about the patriarchy or gender, that's a function of capitalism. When we're talking about masculinity, white supremacy, that's a function of capitalism. Palestine is even a function of capitalism. The environmental stuff, climate change, that is a function of capitalism. Settler colonialism, which is why the left doesn't like Israel, that is a function of capitalism. All of these issues are fundamentally connected because the left believes that capitalism, which they define very, very, very specifically, causes every single problem. So this slide is a slide, and you can see this is actually a DSA image. And this slide was a slide that I got out of a conference that was sponsored by the community college system in California, where they're flat out laying it out. And this person's talking about, what do I mean by liberation? Liberation means working collectively to guarantee us all housing as a human right, food is a right, movement is a right, universal healthcare, universal childcare. The left believes that if we can just take all the resources, all of the private property, all of the money in society right now, and we use that to, like we're going to buy all the houses, or we're going to procure all the houses, and we're going to distribute the houses so that everyone has a place to live. We're going to distribute all the food. What could go wrong with having the left in control of the food supply? We're going to make sure we manage all healthcare, universal healthcare for all, no private doctors, no private insurance, universal childcare, no parental rights for everyone. We're going to talk about that. The left believes that literally all the problems we have in society are caused by capitalism. And they believe that if we can just get rid of capitalism, all of these problems will be solved. And when you hear them say the term liberation, liberation is always, 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 always the goal with the far left. And they will say this flat out. Now, I want to play you a video. This video, I just want people to get a sense of like how ridiculous it is sometimes to hear the left talk about these things. And it always makes me laugh because people on the right used to always tell me, Karlyn, the left never talks about capitalism. Why are you always talking about capitalism? The left never talks about capitalism. Well, guess what? If you actually listen to the left, they talk about capitalism literally all the time. And I promise you, we're going to play you so many clips tonight where you're going to hear them talk about this. Once you start hearing it and once you start noticing the pattern where this is the thing that is at the focal point of what they're doing all the time, you will never hear things the same again. So this is actually a training that I infiltrated not too long ago, a couple weeks ago. And this was actually an organizing call for the Mayday Strong organization, which is an organization that is led by the National Education Association, the teachers unions. And these are some of the people that are organizing protests all over the country right now. Actually, there was a protest today called the Good Trouble protest. They weren't really involved in that, but you are going to see other protests that the Mayday Strong Coalition is organizing. And predominantly, these are the protests you're going to see the teachers unions involved in, like the Chicago Teachers Union is very involved with this group. This was an organizing call they had a couple weeks ago, and I want to play you the video of this lady talking on the call, and you guys are going to freak out. And it was so great. Okay, here she is.
Thank you for having me. And greetings, comrades. I greet you as comrades because I am coming to you with optimism, seriousness, as well as a revolutionary spirit. And I want to talk to you about revolutionary spirit in both the moment of revolution. This is a moment where we have to be willing to imagine big, to imagine bold, and to think beyond this current moment. A sobering reality is that we got here because the thing right before it led us to it. We cannot wish for the society of 2 years ago, of 3 years ago, of 5 years ago. We have to be willing to imagine something radically different because here is the truth. Any semblance of transphobia, patriarchy, white supremacy, capitalism are ingredients and recipe for fascism. If you don't get there quickly, you'll get there eventually. And that is what happened in front of us. We cannot allow these systems of oppression to exist. They are incompatible with our visions of freedom and our visions of liberation. And we have to be bold enough, courageous enough to imagine a different world and be willing to stake our very lives on it. And I am saying that to you very seriously and not in a dramatic term. Our lives are at stake. Our enemy is pro-war. They are pro-profit. They are anti-people and anti-planet. We are pro-people, pro-planet, pro-peace, right? These are our enemies. They intend to destroy us, our bodies, our lives, the planet, and we must be clear. And the way that we can ensure that we not only defeat the far right, which is absolutely our objective right now, but the way that we can ensure that we don't wind up in the same situation 50 years later, because what I know to be true is that we, the people, can defeat a thing. I come from a people that have defeated chattel enslavement on this very earth. I come from a people that have defeated Jim Crow as an institution. I come from a people currently battling the prison industrial complex, and we will defeat that. So I am confident in our ability to defeat a thing. What I am agitating and challenging us on is to not only to show up to defeat the thing, but for us to be the ones to fundamentally transform society so that 20 years from now, another generation of us isn't facing fascism again. Again, we cannot look for the world of 5.
So I'm just going to pause it there. I think you kind of get the idea about that. But listen, this person is talking about fundamentally changing society. That means a revolution against capitalism. That's what they mean when they say that. This person is talking about how capitalism is the epicenter of what they're doing. This person is talking about how capitalism is literally trying to kill them. And I really want people to understand this because this is not a small thing. And we're going to talk specifically about what the left means by capitalism in a moment here, but it's really not a small thing because think about what happens when you have an enemy that you very literally believe is going to kill you and is going to kill every member of your family. That is what they believe capitalism is doing. And so we're going to get into the introduction of what does capitalism actually mean. I do want to remind people that that if you have questions at any point during this presentation, please feel free to put them in the Q&A tab. You can find the Q&A tab at the top of the webinar module here. You can distinguish between chat and Q&A. Please put all questions in the Q&A tab. I will take questions at the end, so it's better to just put the questions in when you have them rather than wait until the end. But let's get into a definition. So what explicitly does the left mean when they say capitalism? And I want to make sure people understand this. My argument is not that capitalism is a perfect model. I think that capitalism, there are many critiques that you can make of it, but we have to have those conversations on a different day, because part of the problem is that your definition of capitalism as a non-leftist, as an anti-communist, it is probably different than what the left's definition of capitalism is. So you can come and say, I can critique capitalism too for reason X, Y, B, and Z. Good for you. That has nothing to do with what the far left believes, and it has nothing to do with what the far left is doing. So you got to step outside of your feelings on this one. You got to step outside of your lived experience, because our goal here is to understand what the left actually believes, because their behaviors happen based on what they believe is true. When the left says capitalism, they are explicitly defining it as private property ownership. That is what they are defining it as. Now, when they say private property, they are referencing bourgeois property, or property that can be used to create generational and privatized wealth. Wealth that is exclusive to you, wealth that is exclusive to your family. What they are not talking about are things like your computer or your phone or your car or your pets or things like that. This is a trick that the left tries to play with people, because one of the things that the left will do is they'll say, don't worry, we're not going to take your stuff. We're not going to take your personal property. We're just going to take your private property. Don't worry about that. Like, you can still have all your stuff. We're just going to take the private property, and then that's going to, or the bourgeois property, they might say. And so what they're trying to do is to trick people into believing that it's really not as bad as you think it is, but it is that bad. When the left is talking about bourgeois property, they're talking about basically anything that you can use to amass a large amount of individual wealth. So here are the things that the left is going to do. And I have them on video saying every single one of these things. We are not going to be able to watch all the clips tonight, but you have to trust me that I do have this on video, and you can find it either on my Substack, on my YouTube channel, stuff like that. If you're looking for a specific video, you can always ask and I can try to get that information to you. When the left says private property ownership, here are the things that the left is going to eliminate if they ever get into power. They're going to take away your ability to own a home. They're going to take away your ability to own land. They're going to take away your ability to own a private business, whether or not that private business is big or small. They're going to take away your rental properties that you might use as a landlord or an Airbnb, because they don't believe landlords should exist. They're going to take away your parental rights over your kids. If you don't understand that one yet, just put that one in your back pocket. We're going to talk about that one, but they do consider parental rights over children to be a form of private property, because they believe that if you can pass generational wealth from parent to child, that is a form of private property ownership. There are other reasons too. And yes, they do consider individual liberties to be a form of private property that, of course, you would not have once you move over to a more collectivized society. Other things the left is going to do is they want to get rid of all private healthcare. No private healthcare, no private insurance, no private doctors. They want to get rid of all private schooling and homeschooling, public schooling only that's available to everyone. They want to get rid of all private energy and gas providers. So essentially, they're the ones that are going to tell you where you can go, how much gas you can have, what traveling you can do, stuff like that. And yes, they do actually want to control the food supply. They want to get rid of all private farms. They believe that farmers are some of the original capitalists, because farmers were some of the original people who privatized land in order to make personal wealth on it by having farms. So they believe in collectivizing all food production, which of course has gone just really, really well all throughout history. That has never been problematic at all. They also have an idea about getting rid of private kitchens within households, so that you would get all your food at the community canteen and you would always eat with the community. And yes, I have them on video saying this. But what the biggest thing that people need to understand is, to the left, capitalism is not just an economic model. capitalism is also a cultural model. And this is what trips most people up when it comes to the far left is you think of capitalism and you think, oh, I go into the store and buy stuff, that's capitalism, or there's price gouging and that's capitalism, or, they want to control the means of production, whatever that means today. I mean, I don't even know how people still buy into this means of production thing, because quite frankly, we don't live in a factory-based society anymore. Yes, factories do still exist, but we live in a time where you can create things very, very simply with very few resources. And so the whole means of production argument of the left controlling the factories, it's kind of an outdated model based on the Industrial Revolution, but a lot of people think that that's still the goal. What most people don't understand is that capitalism is also a cultural model with things that uphold the capitalist nature of our society. And when I say capitalist nature, I mean things like individualism and meritocracy. And we're going to look at a few things later that I'm going to demonstrate this. But I do just want to make sure that people really understand this. We're going to watch this clip from one of our favorite socialists. Her name is Mary Bowman. Mary Bowman is actually a professor of nursing at DePaul University in where is that? Minneapolis, I'm pretty sure. Mary Bowman spoke at the Socialism Conference a couple weeks ago, or a couple years ago. But she spoke a couple weeks ago too, actually. And I want you to hear what Mary Bowman says is the ultimate goal of what the socialists are trying to do, because it is actually very serious and they are very serious about it. Let me just get up her video. Here we go.
And yes, ultimately, and if that wasn't clear from the end of my talk, that will require a revolution. We cannot be free under capitalism. We cannot be free in this society as long as any person is in prison, as long as any person is denied health care for something necessary. No, that will never be free.
So we cannot be free until everyone is free. What Mary is saying there is that we as a society will never be free until we are liberated from the oppressive nature of capitalism or private property ownership. Now, in order to understand capitalism as a cultural model, because yes, it is the abolition of capitalism and the far left's goals for the economy, are those dangerous? Yeah, absolutely they are. But far more dangerous to me is how the left views capitalism as part of the cultural model. And so I want to start to bring some of this into focus. What does capitalism have to do with racism? What does capitalism have to do with gender? What does capitalism have to do with the nuclear family? If you learn these three things, you will understand more about what the far left believes and what they're trying to do than pretty much anyone else on the internet. And the biggest thing that gives people the most trouble when they start understanding the far left is that when the left says things like whiteness or white supremacy, they are not talking about skin color. Now, I'm not going to argue that there aren't trickle-down impacts that create what some people call a so-called anti-white society or anti-white people who are against white people. I'm not going to argue that doesn't happen. However, what I want you to understand is we can't take the trickle-down notions of, quite frankly, retarded people in society who believe this is about skin color and apply that to the larger group. Because I have watched literally thousands of hours of leftist training. I have almost never or very, very rarely heard them talk about white people. In fact, I've heard the opposite. It's much more common that I hear that black people can be considered white, that whiteness is about who owns the power structure, that whiteness is related to property ownership. And I'm going to show you some examples of that. And what you're seeing is that they have equated whiteness with the idea of productivity, individualism, meritocracy, all of the things that uphold our society that is more about, creating an individual experience rather than being a part of the collective. So let me break this down. Here is what the left believes. And when I tell you what the left believes, I'm not saying you have to agree with them, but I'm saying that our goal here is to understand them so that we can actually learn how to speak their language. And whether or not you agree with them or whether or not what they believe pisses you off or you have a debunk for it, it doesn't really matter because your feelings are not going to change what the left actually believes and the premise that they're operating from. So, what the left believes is is that capitalism, which is defined as private property ownership, created slavery in the United States because slavery is the ownership of people as private property. Okay? Everyone understand that. Capitalism, private property ownership, created the institution of slavery, which is the ownership of people as private property. Slavery then created something called systemic racism, which is the system that upholds racism, if we just break it down. You might also hear it referred to as institutional racism, the institution that upholds racism. And when they are talking about systemic racism or institutional racism, they're not talking about your skin color. They are talking about capitalism as the system or the institution that upholds racism in our society. And finally, they believe that abolishing capitalism is literally the only way to get rid of racism. We will not solve racism in this country until capitalism is abolished. And by the way, this is actually in the dictionary. They changed the definition of racism in 2020 during the BLM riots to specifically reflect systemic racism or institutional racism. And even more than that, I actually wrote a book earlier this year. You can find it on Amazon. It's called A Brief History of Racism, where I actually laid out the development and the invention of the word racism, and I followed the evolution of the definition of the term racism since it was invented in 1902 in America. And I'll tell you what, the term racism has a long and storied history of being about the system or the structure. I have major activists, civil rights leaders, social justice people for decades and decades and decades explicitly saying that racism means capitalism and capitalism means racism. And so we see this over and over and over again. And I'm going to show you some examples in this. One of the most famous examples that most people are familiar with is this is a document that appeared in the Smithsonian Museum in 2020 called The Aspects and Assumptions of White Culture in the United States. Now, I just want to read some of the things that are on this flyer, and I know it's a little bit blurry. I apologize for that, but it is what I have. And I just want to read some of the attributes here so that you can understand this is not related to individual skin color. This is all related to the aspects of the left considers to be part of a capitalist society. So, number one, we have rugged individualism. Why would individualism be specific to people with white skin color? We have family structure. That is a reference to the nuclear family. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. Employs scientific method. Are you telling me that Black people can't employ the scientific method? Of course they can. It's not related to skin color. It's related to upholding the capitalist system. We've got things like work ethic. I mean, that's pretty on the nose for capitalism. We've got things like status and peer authority. That's all about capitalism. It's all about status, bourgeois. Things like time. They're not saying that Black people can't tell time. They're saying time, holding a schedule, punching it on a time clock that upholds the capitalist structure. Every single thing on this chart is about capitalism. It's not about skin color. And once you understand this, you can start to look at this information in a new way to say, oh, they're attacking something different than what I thought they were. You can also look at just the articles that they write on their websites. This was on NPR. This was back in 2021. Understanding multiracial whiteness, and Trump supporters. What the F is multiracial whiteness? Are you telling me that any race can actually be white? Well, that's not true if whiteness is about skin color. It's only true if whiteness is about capitalism. We can also look at this headline from the Los Angeles Times, and I think this was back in 2020 as well. Larry Elder is the black face of white supremacy. How can someone be the black face of white supremacy? He's literally black. Well, Larry Elder is a capitalist. Larry Elder is part of the bourgeois, part of the property ownership class, and that is why Larry Elder can be the black face of white supremacy. Now, I don't want you to take my word for it. As always, I want you to listen to Cheryl Harris. Cheryl Harris wrote the seminal paper called "Whiteness is Property." This is a very famous paper on the far left. She published it in Harvard Law Review in 1993. This is a speech that Cheryl Harris gave 20 years after the publication of her paper. I have the full speech on my YouTube channel. If you want to go and watch it, it is also just available on YouTube in general. She gave this speech in October of 2014, and I have two clips from this speech that I want to play for you to demonstrate this point that whiteness is not about skin color. It's really about capitalism. And we're just going to get into this first clip here. Let me just get the video. And this first clip is literally going to say that whiteness is not about skin color. Listen.
Whiteness is not a skin color or even a racial type. It is a social relation constructed on exclusion, structural privilege, and its valorization.
Whiteness is not a skin color or even a racial type. That's a little bit on the nose, isn't it? But Cheryl Harris got even more on the nose. And in this clip, you're going to hear her say, wait a second, Black people can be white too. Listen.
Secondly, post-racialism's commitment to protect some value in whiteness, however relative, what Derek Bell called the promise not to be the face at the bottom of the well, it coexists with expanding whiteness to encompass non-whites. And I think Chuck was alluding to this a little bit yesterday. Post-racial whiteness is conditionally available to persons of any racial group, even some blacks.
Post-racial whiteness is available to anyone of any racial group, including some blacks. I know this might be information that people don't want to acknowledge, but the fact is they are not talking about skin color. They are talking about the system. That's why it's available to some blacks, because Black people can start businesses too. This is a poster that I got in a socialist magazine. I actually got this magazine at the Socialism Conference in 2023 in person. And it is a quote from Angela Davis. Angela Davis is one of the patron saints of the far left. Racism cannot be separated from capitalism. I don't know how it could be more clear, but actually they did make it more clear, because this year, and this book actually just got presented at the Socialism Conference a couple weeks ago. This is a book by Arun, and it literally, the title of the book is "What is Anti-Racism and Why It Means Anti-Capitalism?" And the thumbnail beside it, that was actually a video from the launch of the book. Anti-racism must mean anti-capitalism. The left is very, very clear when you start listening to what they're saying. This is an example of when you're going to see, oftentimes what you see the left doing is when they talk about slavery, when they talk about racism, they intermix it with capitalism over and over and over again. This is one of my favorite videos. This is a video of a teacher education trainer named Dina Simmons. Dina Simmons made tens of thousands of dollars providing consulting services to the Cambridge, Massachusetts school district. You can see the Cambridge, Massachusetts school district actually publicized her on their Twitter feed. This was back in 2022. I wanted to play you this video of Dina where you hear her talk about capitalism and slavery, capitalism and racism, and whiteness. She talks about it interchangeably, almost as though they are the exact same thing.
Based on the people that we're citing here, Angela Davis, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and others, that a lot of their work is inseparable from anti-capitalism. Is abolitionist teaching anti-capitalist by nature?
Abolition is anti-capitalist by nature. You know, we know right now that capitalism is the structure that we are under. And so we're going to use this structure to our best ability. But what we also know is that capitalism will not free us.
And you got to remember that this country was built off of stolen Black labor, and that all of those folks who are positions of power who have that money, you got it because you stole it. You know, and I think, you know, it's always so funny. Can I throw money at that? I'm like, yo, that money's mine. Like, that money is mine, actually. You stole it, you know. And I think, of course, you know, being, you know, an abolitionist is anti-capitalism, right? Because there's a connection between capitalism and slavery in this country. There's a capitalism between, you know, how communities like redlining were built to disenfranchise people, how, you know, the hierarchy of structures in organizations, who gets paid and who has the power to say this, that's all capitalism. And honestly, to me, that's whiteness. And we have to eradicate whiteness. We have to abolish whiteness as well. And
Last word, Goldie.
So could not be more clear. Talking about anti-capitalism, anti-capitalism. To me, this is capitalism, and to me, that's whiteness, and we have to abolish whiteness. They are using the terms completely interchangeably, because to the far left, They are interchangeable. Now you might say, Karlyn, are they referring to skin color in this instance? Are they referring to skin color in that instance? There are almost no instances where the left is referring to skin color. I mean, again, it does happen every once in a blue moon where they actually are talking about skin color. When you recently saw the South African president get called out by Donald Trump in the Oval Office for specifically targeting white people for murder, that was actually about skin color. South Africa is a completely different thing. And so I don't want people to be confused, because people see this footage from South Africa. That is legitimately about skin color, but we are not South Africa. We are America. We have different problems. We have different activists. They have different philosophies. And so just because something is happening in South Africa doesn't mean the far left in America is following South Africa. I promise you they're not. They never even talk about South Africa. So another example of this that people might be familiar with is, of course, you look at things like the Black Lives Matter movement. What was the Black Lives Matter movement actually about? What did they actually want? Well, they wanted the abolition of the police, defunding the police, abolishing the police. That was their main argument. They set fire to a police station in Minneapolis. They commandeered a police station in Seattle. It was all about defunding the police, abolishing the police. Why do they want to get rid of the police? Well, the police are one of the primary targets. They're enemies of the left. They hate the cops. They hate the prison industrial complex. They very literally want to abolish all prisons and free all criminals, because they believe that that there will be no crime, or very reduced crime, in a post-capitalist society or the Marxist utopia. And the reason they hate the police so much is because they actually believe the police are the managers or the upholders of private property. And they believe the start of the police in this country, going back to capitalism creating slavery, they believe the start of the police in this country was to apprehend runaway slaves by the property owners. So the start of the police was to apprehend the runaway private property and return it to the owners, okay? And this is an example of a tweet that was sent, I think, back in 2020, where they're actually giving 8th graders in schools assignments to teach them that the police are the same as the KKK. And you can actually see it demonstrated here, where you've got the police are the slave masters, and they're selling the slaves, and they're the slave catchers. And then they're the KKK, and then they became the sheriffs, and then they became the police. This is the evolution that the left sees for the police. So that is why they don't like them. They believe they are the managers of private property. Again, we're looking at capitalism not just as an economic model, but also as a cultural model. Capitalism upholds all of the norms. Now, we're going to move into the part of the presentation on gender and the nuclear family, because you want to talk about capitalism as a cultural model. Your head is going to explode when you see some of the videos that I'm going to show you around gender and around the nuclear family. So I want everyone to we're going to watch this video first, okay? So, you might think that the term queer is related to being gay, or you might think the term queer is related to being trans. It is neither of those things. Queer is a positional term that is defined based on its opposition to normativity. Normativity is a word that you hear on the left an awful lot. Normativity essentially means the norms that uphold capitalism, the norms that uphold our society. And in the case of gender and the nuclear family are the two primary norms that the left is attacking all the time, specifically within queer ideology, to try to undermine capitalist society. So the first thing I want you to do is I want you to hear from the left themselves. This is actually a clip from a show on the Discovery Channel called The Book of Queer. So it's a very it's out there in pop culture, and they're explicitly going to tell you that queer is about being against the normal, the legitimate, the dominant. It's not about being gay or trans. It's about being against the norms that uphold society. So listen to the video.
Howdy, I'm Eric Cervini, the Book of Queer's resident homo historian. Welcome to the footnotes. You may have noticed that we haven't labeled Abe gay, because that wouldn't make too much sense. Why? Because sexuality, just like race and gender, is what we call a social construct, or a concept that we as a society just came up with. And during Lincoln's time, the idea of a homosexual hadn't yet been conceived or constructed in the English language. For hundreds of years, people didn't agree on a word for men who loved men. And given all of these changes in language throughout history, that's why we love the word queer. All it means, in the words of queer theorist David Halperin, is whatever's at odds with the normal, the legitimate, the dominant. And hey, we may even come up with newer social constructs to describe ourselves in the future. After all, they're really just figments of our collective imagination.
Social constructs are just figments of our collective imagination. Well, that includes gender. Because the reason you see so much fuss about trans ideology in school, queer ideology in school, it's not actually about getting the kids to transition their gender, although that is something that they're doing. And, thankfully, the Trump administration is now issuing orders to try to put a stop to that, because, of course, that is going to go down. Kids cutting off body parts and getting on hormones is going to go down as one of the greatest atrocities inflicted on humanity when they look back on this in the future. Of this, I'm absolutely sure. But what I want you to hear is, although that is abhorrent and we definitely want to stop that, that's actually not the goal of what queer ideology is doing. When the left is pushing things like drag queen story hour, the left is not actually trying to sexualize your kids. They're not trying to turn your kids into drag queens. When the left is pushing these ideas, what they're trying to do is to teach your children that gender does not exist. They're trying to teach your kids that gender is a social construct, that it was a social construct that was created by capitalism. So again, this is what the left believes. They believe that capitalism created the social constructs of men and women. The social constructs are what you call the gender binary. Gender binary just means men and women, and there are two, and you are one or the other. The left believes that capitalism, private property ownership, created these social constructs when they put men in the workplace, where they had access to all the power and all the money, and women in the home doing the unpaid labor of raising the next generation of proletarian workers in the nuclear family. We'll talk about that in a sec. The goal of the left, the primary goal, is to abolish the gender binary, because they believe that these are just fake categories that were created by capitalism. They want to abolish the idea of men, and they want to abolish the idea of women. And this is really important for people to understand. People think the left hates women. They want men and women's sports, or the left hates men because they're doing all this toxic masculinity stuff. The left doesn't hate men over women. They don't hate women over men. They hate gender. They hate all gender. They don't want men to exist. They don't want women to exist, because that is a binary. So when you're seeing things like these crazy pronouns that are being introduced, or you're seeing things like non-binary, what does a non-binary they, them identity mean? Non-binary literally means no binary, because the left believes that in order to abolish capitalism, they need to attack the gender binary, because the gender binary is one of the things that upholds the nuclear family, which we'll talk about in a second. The nuclear family being the reproduction mechanism of capitalism. We talked about abortion when I told you I went undercover at an abortion conference earlier in the presentation. The reason that the left is shout your abortion up until birth and all that stuff is because they believe that abortion liberates women from the reproductive roles forced on them by capitalism within the gender binary. And they're not overt about this. I've covered stories that no one else has covered on the internet, like the story of Tufts University studying non-binary 3-year-olds to try to reverse engineer how to convince people to be non-binary. I've actually covered, do you guys know there's a specific groomer middle school in New York City that is exclusive for trans and non-binary students? I covered that a couple years ago. And actually, since I covered that, and I'll play you this video, the trans non-binary school in New York City has actually grown. They've released marketing materials. And let me just show you what is going on with the kids in the trans school in New York City. Hang on. Here it goes.
Transformative Schools is a visionary after-school program serving trans kids here in New York City.
We're a team of trans and queer teachers trying to start a trans school. As far as we know, we're the only program serving LGBTQ youth in New York City under the age of 12.
And the dream is to grow from an after-school program and be a middle school for trans kids, a home away from home here in New York City.
The space that we're creating is one where kids feel safe and seen and understood.
We've been working with students ages 9 to 15, doing classes everything from engineering to yoga to computer coding to art. We also do a bunch of policy and advocacy work.
We've gotten involved with the Community Education Council, which is New York City's version of a school board, and we're showing up at those school board meetings and protecting trans kids and building community, and I feel very proud of that work.
And also seeing the parents feeling the support of having a space that oftentimes these kids don't have in their schools is really important for us. Visibility matters so much. When kids see you, they understand that your existence is enough because you're here, and them being able to see you means that they get to exist and they get to see themselves become doctors, become teachers, become activists, become whatever it is that they want to. If they don't have anyone that they can see doing this work and being alive and doing this work, then they don't know that their futures are possibilities. And so we are their possibility models.
I think we live in a scary time in the world right now, in that trans people, particularly trans kids, are under attack. And I am incredibly proud to be able to do all this work to try and stand up for them and try and make their lives easier.
Trans kids deserve trans schools!
So I do think it's significant that they called the schools transformative schools, because when the left uses the term trans, they don't necessarily mean transition your gender from man to woman or woman to man. What they actually mean is transform gender or transcend gender. So you'll see the left talking a lot about transforming gender, which means abolishing the gender binary, moving beyond the gender binary. And we see this stuff like this show up in just everyday trainings that take place in workplaces. This is a training that was funded by the Washington, D.C. mayor's office a couple years ago. And you can see in this training, just on this slide here, they're talking about dismantling gender spaces. What can we do to dismantle gender spaces? They're talking about dismantling the idea of there being two genders. I also covered this federal government training a couple years ago, where this was a federally funded government training that literally taught that if you go into a school classroom and you write, there are only two genders on the chalkboard, that is a form of harassment. And I'm going to play you a video of that clip so you can hear that. Here it is.
And then we're required to intervene if we witness discrimination, harassment, right? I know at school sometimes when we say the word bullying, our brain just shuts off. Like, don't talk to me anymore about bullying. But if we're talking about on that one, what the law says in intimidation, that's kind of like the lowest bar right there, the lowest hanging fruit. Intimidation, what does that look like? You know, if a student walks into a classroom and says, there's only two genders, and writes it on the board, as I've been getting calls about when we start school again, right? Kids come back from the summer and they've got a lot to say. That's intimidation. That's harassment. We have a duty to intervene. But how do we do it? How does our staff know how to do it, right? We have to give them those tools. Most of our staff have not been trained. Even you all here today who found out about this because you're in this work, you're looking for it, like 75% of you, this is your first gender identity training, right?
So you can see how these ideas go from being crazy ideas on the far left of gender is a social construct of capitalism. Well, who's ever going to buy into those ideas? Well, apparently the federal government bought into those ideas, at least during the Biden administration, because this was a literal teachers training that took place in Orange County, California in September of 2023. And we found it live on the internet with only a couple of views on it. So this is how this stuff makes its way into the real world. All of a sudden, you've got teachers that are telling students in schools, you can't say there are only two genders. And the reason that's happening is because they want to abolish the gender binary. They want to abolish the idea of men and women. They want kids to believe that gender is fluid, that you can change your gender as easy as changing an outfit. That's what Drag Queen Story Hour is all about, showing these cartoon-like characters that dress up in frilly dresses and sparkles, and all of a sudden they can change their gender. And that is why they're teaching kids this ideology. You don't abolish gender by issuing a law. You abolish gender by getting into the public schools and teaching kids when they are very, very, very young that gender does not exist. So why do they want to abolish gender? What is going on there? What is the goal of abolishing gender? Well, in order to understand that, you have to understand the nuclear family. Now, most people know the nuclear family is absolutely a target on the far left, and we're going to watch a lot of clips to that effect. But you have to understand why it's a target, because it's not just that they hate their parents. That's not what it is. It's not just that they have mommy and daddy issues. It's not just that, they believe the nuclear family is like a normative thing, although they do. The big reason the left wants to abolish the nuclear family is because they believe the nuclear family is the literal means of production of capitalism. So talk about the means of production, talking about controlling the means of production. I mentioned earlier, it's kind of absurd to think of the means of production today as the factories, because although factories do exist, there are a lot of things that are produced in society outside of the factory model, right? How is capitalism produced? How is capitalism reproduced? How is capitalism fed? How is capitalism perpetuated? The left believes that this is all because of the nuclear family. This is something called social reproduction theory. Social reproduction theory says that social systems will reproduce themselves until they are abolished or until they are disrupted. The left believes that the nuclear family is the literal means of production of capitalism, because women who are oppressed by the patriarchy have kids. They do the unpaid labor to have children within the nuclear family. Those children are going to be the future oppressed workers of the capitalist model. So basically, the nuclear family is going to raise these kids with capitalist values, like you have to go out and get a job, and that teaches the children that they are going to be the future workers under capitalism. They're primed for this when they're kids, and so that's one of the ways the capitalist model is being perpetuated. But they also believe that children are considered to be a form of private property when parental rights exist. They believe that children should be raised by everyone in the community rather than in the privatized model, because this is about passing generational wealth from parent to child. And this is quite literally where all of the attacks on parental rights comes from. It comes from this idea. We know that parental rights are under attack all over the country. There are all sorts of states passing laws that give the schools more power over the kids than parents do. Most of this is related to trans surgery, transing kids, queering kids, stuff like that. Trans minors protected from parents under Washington state law. This is an article that appeared in The Atlantic, says children are not property. The idea that underlies the right-wing campaign for parental rights. It was funny because when I was reading this article originally, I'm like, this was written by a socialist. This was obviously written by a socialist, and only a socialist could write this article. Well, guess what? At the end of the article, the author's like, I'm a socialist, like flat out in the article. I was like, yeah, of course you're a socialist. Like this is a socialist mentality. And you can see when you get over to the far left and you start looking at their books, these are two of our favorite abolish the family activists. We've got Emmy O'Brien and Sophie Lewis. Emmy O'Brien very literally wrote a book called Family Abolition, Capitalism and the Communizing of Care. Sophie Lewis has written multiple books about abolish the family, including the Manifesto for Care and Liberation. If you come to my streams on YouTube or Rumble, we watch Emmy O'Brien and Sophie Lewis an awful lot. These ideas are very, very pronounced on the far left. And I do just want to play you several videos of different leftist trainings that I've been in to demonstrate this fact. So the first video that we're going to watch is actually Sophie. Sophie is our queen. Sophie is our ginger dragon. We love watching Sophie because Sophie just says the quiet part out loud literally all the time. And so I want to play you this clip of Sophie talking about parental rights.
Yes, it's true. What the far right says, feminism wants to abolish the family. To hell with family values, and all capitalist value for that matter. And fuck parents' rights. My hunch is that just beyond the horizon, beckoning to those of us who want to hear it, there is a world of relationship no longer strangled by scarcity and no longer held hostage by economics. Thank you.
No longer held hostage by economics. That kind of seems like a reference to capitalism to me, doesn't it? The next video I want to show you is again of one of our favorite socialists, Mary Bowman. This is again in Mary's talk at the Socialism Conference in 2023, where Mary is going to flat out tell you that she thinks destroying the nuclear family is a pretty good idea.
But some of their fears may be legitimate, because destroying the nuclear family through sexual liberation and queer relationship anarchy sounds pretty great.
Destroying the nuclear family through sexual liberation and a queer relationship anarchy sounds pretty great to Mary. I also love this clip that we're going to show from the Denver communists. The Denver communists flat out said that children are a form of private property. Let me get this clip up real quick. Listen to this.
It's important to get the politics straight. So to understand the transition period, we must first of all understand what the goal is. So just briefly, Karl Marx was a revolutionary. His goal was the replacement of capitalism by communism, not the superficial modification of capitalism. His critique of capitalism was extremely radical, covering gender and sexual relations, the relations of people to the environment, the overcoming of all forms of oppression, the radical democratization of all social relations, the abolition of all states, the elimination of private productive property, and the private ownership of children. He foresaw an international society with no money.
Hang on. What was that? What did he just say? Not only the elimination of private productive property, but also the private ownership of children. Did everyone catch that? Don't worry. We're going to watch it again. Hang on. Hang on. We're going to go back a little bit. Yup. Private ownership. I keep telling you guys, when they say private property, they mean parental rights. This is why there are so many attacks on parental rights. All of the attacks on parental rights are coming from this idea. It is literally in the Communist Manifesto. Everyone owes me a $2 super chat. Let's get this clip. That was like 20 seconds into the video. 20 seconds.
Get the politics straight. So to understand the transition period, we must first of all understand what the goal is. So just briefly, Karl Marx was a revolutionary. His goal was the replacement of capitalism by communism, not the superficial modification of capitalism. His critique of capitalism was extremely radical, covering gender and sexual relations, the relations of people to the environment, the overcoming of all forms of oppression, the radical democratization of all social relations, the abolition of all states, the elimination of private productive property, and the private ownership of children. He foresaw an international society with no money, no prisons, no oppression, no exploitation, no economic classes, and no borders. All this was connected at its core to the seizure of economic and political power by the working class, those who worked for a wage.
All right. Is everyone clear? Everyone clear? I said a lot of the quiet parts out loud in that one, didn't they? Not only about the nuclear family, but also about all the other things that they consider to be problems under capitalism, including borders. Of course, you can't have private property without having borders. That is why the left is attacking ICE currently and trying to sabotage everything they're doing. But let's focus back on the nuclear family. We can talk about borders another day. That's just another little aspect of what the left believes. We're not going to cover that today. As a reminder, guys, if you have questions, please make sure you put them in the Q&A tab. I will be taking all questions. We are almost through our full presentation, so I will be taking as many questions as you guys have in the Q&A tab at the very end. I do have a couple more clips I want to show you. This is a clip, again, this is a conference that was hosted by the Community Colleges of California. So this was a taxpayer-funded conference in California where they are explicitly talking about queering the nuclear family and how problematic the nuclear family is to them.
The nuclear family is that restrictive family model that consists of two differently gendered adults in a fertile monogamous relationship, living together and raising their biological children. So in other words, a monogamous heterosexual couple and their offspring living together. And that nuclear family vision was constructed to fit the needs of a capitalist, heteronormative, patriarchal, and white supremacist society. It was built in the 19th and 20th century for an industrialized capitalist system. One person stays at home to do the unpaid labor, so the other can work as many paid hours as possible. In sociology, we call this the breadwinner homemaker model. It's patriarchal because women are expected to stay home, work for free, and be economically dependent on men. It naturalizes a version of femininity as fixed and satisfied with this nurturing role, and a version of masculinity that is fixed and that rejects care work in favor of taking care of business. It's heteronormative because it naturalizes that differently gendered division of labor, plus other pillars of heterosexuality like monogamy and separation of friendship and romantic relationships. It's part of white supremacy because it centers a family structure that's most common in white families and stigmatizes other types of families, whether they be extended or dispersed or single parent households or matriarchal structures, etc., that are more common in BIPOC and immigrant communities. These traditions have deep cultural and emotional significance, but are too often viewed as pathological because they deviate from this nuclear model. So as we can see from that leaked Roe v. Wade decision, like they're coming for all of our rights. They're trying to force everybody back into a heteronormative patriarchal box. But the model they're trying to force us all into has been unraveling for decades. Even straight people are bailing on it. Next slide, please, Rob. So across sexualities and gender identities, people are increasingly seeking relationships of love and intimacy and care that exist beyond these heteronormative family structures. This is what Judith Stacy and others have called queering the family. So this nuclear family model is not able to meet people's economic, cultural, or emotional needs. It was never intended to. Capitalism has turned that breadwinner homemaker model into the dual earner model. All adults work outside the home to pay the rent, buy groceries. Women are expected to work the second shift for free, cooking and cleaning, bathing kids, etc. And you're expected to pay for childcare because you're gone all the time.
Okay, so you can see them talking there about, again, this is pretty overt. They see capitalism and the nuclear family to be directly related. The last clip I want to show you, just to beat this dead horse, this is actually a very recent clip that I just got a couple weeks ago. I infiltrated an organizing meeting of the Seattle Revolutionary Socialists where they were talking about queer liberation. And wouldn't you know it, but the abolition of the nuclear family was at the center of queer liberation. So again, when they say queer, they're not talking about being gay or trans. They're talking about an anti-capitalist far-left political ideology that is designed to fundamentally destabilize normativity. You just heard in the previous clip, they're talking about cis heteronormativity. It basically means the same thing. These mean the cultural norms that uphold capitalism. So anytime you're talking about abolishing gender, anytime you're talking about abolishing the nuclear family, what they're trying to get at is the cultural model of capitalism. And you're going to see these Seattle Revolutionary Socialists say this overtly in their talk about queer liberation.
The existence and acceptance in society of queer and trans people is a threat to the social narrative that the ruling class uses to uphold the structure of the nuclear family, an exploitative structure they created for their own ends. They attempt to uphold that structure by propagating narratives that women and men are inherently different from each other by nature, that sex and gender are the same thing, and that people who transgress these fabricated boundaries are at best sick and at worst predatory. In a word, bullshit.
Where it is that the origin of like oppression of queer people, both trans and also gay people, there's a common origin, and in terms of the nuclear family being a very useful tool for reproducing new workers and having a system in which to train them through specifically women's oppression in the form of making them handle, like the term you used was reproductive labor, which is a term that we Marxists use to describe just like everything that it takes to train and raise and otherwise prepare the next generation of workers after they're born.
I hear a lot of rhetoric online and especially, in right-wing circles of like abolition of the nuclear family, and they want to come after traditional gender roles and traditional nuclear family and like one man, one woman and the kids and the dogs and the 2.5 fences or whatever it is. And they kind of paint it as if that husband, wife, 2.5 kids, and a golden retriever is like how it is, how it's always been, and how like it's just human nature. It's just the way it is. But when I first kind of started, exploring Marxism and read Engel's book on the origin of the family, it really is, you think about the nuclear family, and it was essentially created to send men to work in factories for low wages and high output, and then was meant to keep women home, isolated, so that they can't independently organize, and then also, raising the next generation of workers so that they basically have a complete endless flow. And when you look at the nuclear family like that in an honest lens, abolition of the nuclear family doesn't sound so big and scary. And it's these little pieces and these little, specific phrases that get taken out of context to make Marxism seem like this kind of evil, scary thing. But in reality, abolition of the nuclear family is part of liberation for women, liberation for queer people, liberation for trans people. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting topic. Thanks, y'all.
So the reason I wanted to play that clip in particular was, you just hear, once you hear these clips back to back over and over and over, and again, I have a massive archive of these clips. I have some of them archived on my Substack. We have a lot of them on the YouTube channel. I have thousands of hours of this stuff documented via Socialism Saturday, spy streams, things like that. But once you hear the clips back to back to back, you really start to understand this is not about anything other than a constant and perpetual attack on capitalism. And going back to a slide I showed you at the beginning of the presentation, let me just get it up real quick. What I want people to understand, because a common question I get is, well, Karlyn, if everything means capitalism, if everything relates back to capitalism, then why don't they just say the word capitalism? And, that might be a fair question. But what you have to remember is, and I think this chart or this meme kind of shows it pretty nicely, it's not just one aspect of capitalism. Capitalism has many aspects that influence society. And what they're trying to do, and what the term intersectionality means, if you guys have heard that term before, a very popular term on the left, intersectionality is kind of known to mean all the different ways that you are oppressed. But I would say intersectionality is all the different ways you are oppressed by capitalism, because the left believes that capitalism quite literally created all oppression. And so when you're talking about racism and whiteness meaning capitalism, when you're talking about the patriarchy, the gender binary meaning capitalism, when you're talking about settler colonialism, which we didn't talk about today, or Palestine, which we didn't talk about, these are related to capitalism. When you're talking about environmental social justice, these are related to capitalism. What they're doing is they are attacking capitalism from multiple different vectors. So it's not as though they can just use the term capitalism for all of this, because whiteness is a specific aspect of capitalism. The patriarchy or the gender binary is a different aspect of capitalism. Settler colonialism is a different aspect of capitalism. That's about stealing land from indigenous people and privatizing it for exclusive use of the capitalist or the bourgeois. Palestine is related to capitalism because it is a decolonization effort. They don't care that that Israel is Jewish. This has nothing to do with anti-Semitism or Jew hate. The reason the left supports Palestine is Palestine are seen as the oppressed people who are rising up against their capitalist oppressors. Environmental justice and climate change, they believe that the constant pursuit of the profit motive by capitalism created climate change. It created this environmental emergency that is very literally going to kill us all. So they can't use the term capitalism for all of these things, but yet every single one of these things, when you dig in deep about what the left believes, every single one of these things always comes back to capitalism. Now, we didn't get a chance to cover all of these things today because I am trying to do a shorter introductory presentation for people who are new to my work. But there are places we can talk about all of those issues. But what I want people to really walk away with is this. If you learn nothing else from the presentation, I need you to wrap your head around this idea. And then even when we get into other areas like environmental justice, or like the borders, or like settler colonialism, or like what's going on in Palestine, or like reproductive justice, if you understand this component of it, you will understand what the left is doing. What the left believes is that capitalism, whiteness in this case, created the gender binary created the nuclear family, and the nuclear family upholds capitalism. And if you understand this, if you understand that all of these ideas are inextricably linked, that all of these ideas come back to the abolition of capitalism, which they define as private property ownership, you will understand the left. Now, I know this might be a little tricky for people to wrap their heads around. And again, please make sure you're putting questions in the Q&A tab. If you're feeling confused, if you're feeling like this is a lot of information, I can completely understand that. But if you can get down to this core point, everything else about the left will become clear at this point. So I hope I've done a good job of making that case. We are relatively on time. I will stay as long as I need to answer as many questions as I can. As always, you guys will be getting a copy of the recording after the presentation if you have to take off. Just a couple more quick things, though. Now, if you want more information, I do actually have a longer introductory class. So if you would like more information, you can actually find the longer How to Speak Socialist class, which has some of the clips that we watched in this presentation. It also has different clips. It has information about Palestine. It has information about borders. It has information about a couple other subjects that we didn't touch on today. You can find the How to Speak Socialist on-demand class over on the Substack, Karlyn, Karlyn, .substack.com, and just click on the How to Speak Socialist link at the top of the recording, and it will take you right to this presentation. It's right at the top of the page. This is 4 hours long. It goes much more in depth into clips and stuff like that. I did see a question come into the Q&A tab of if I will be redoing the How to Speak Socialist class live. Yes, at some point. But for right now, just access the on-demand class, and it's fine. I see Anonymous Weirdo in the chat says, sorry I'm late. Thank you, Karlyn. I'm glad you found Adam Green. I appreciate your work, and I hope I can find a recording of this presentation. Yes, every single person who is registered for this presentation, if you're listening right now in the live presentation, you will be getting a copy of the recording. I will also put the recording up on the Substack, and please share it, guys. Please share it. I want to make this information as widely available to as many people as possible, because once you learn how to speak the language of the far left, it's just really impossible to not see what they're doing in the world. Couple other resources, and I'm just going to leave this up as I answer your questions. Here are places you can find me. I stream on YouTube, Rumble, Kick, and X Monday through Friday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. I also do Socialism Saturdays on Saturdays at 6 p.m. Socialism Saturday is a dedicated show to covering the radical revolutionary far left, but I do often cover them during the week as well. The weekly show is kind of like, it's a mishmash of different types of content. Oftentimes we do cover the far left. Sometimes we might cover other stuff as well. So make sure you're subscribed on whichever platform is your favorite platform. YouTube tends to have the best chat for my content, but you can subscribe on whatever platform you like. You can also find and support my work over on my Substack and on decodetheleft.com. I am 100% funded by people like you, and I want to thank everyone who made a donation when you signed up for this webinar. Of course, I want to make my content as free to as many people as possible. The way that I'm able to keep so much of my content for free is because you guys voluntarily support what I'm doing, which I really appreciate. So if you are in a position to financially support my work, please sign up for a monthly or annual membership on my Substack. That is my number one way to support my work. That is Karlyn, Karlyn.substack.com. $8 a month, $80 a year. You guys keep me in business, and I can't do this without you. You can find other ways to donate to my work, including making a one-time gift over on decodetheleft.com/support. And I will be soon launching a nonprofit, so you're going to be able to make tax-deductible gifts for my work. It's not quite ready yet, but it will be very soon. And so there'll be more information about that. But for right now, if you want to support my work, those are my best options. If you would like to bring this presentation to a group in your community, and I'm willing to zoom into different community groups and kind of do this stuff relatively low cost, or if you want me to travel somewhere, of course, you're going to have to pay for that. But like, if you just want me to zoom into your meeting or your group, just reach out. Schedule a time. I'm more than happy to bring this presentation if you have local Republican groups, conservative groups, parent groups, just a big group of friends that you all want to see this presentation. Let me know. I will be doing more live presentations that are open to the general public as well. So keep an eye on the Substack, keep an eye on the website, and you will find opportunities to sign up for those. And with that, I'm going to leave that up, and I'm going to go ahead and start going through the Q&A tab to take questions. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A tab. It is the only tab I'm going to be looking at for the rest of the presentation. So I'm just going to go down. Let's see. We answered Pete's question about the 4-hour How to Speak Socialist class. You can find that on demand over on the Substack. Thank you, Pete, for that question. Are they going to take away my guns? Actually, the left isn't really focused on taking away your guns, Morgan, to be honest. The left actually does buy guns. The left has socialist gun club groups. And so, honestly, the left is not really fighting the gun issue right now. They're much more focused on other things. I haven't even seen them talk about guns in a long time. Will they try to take them away? Yeah, probably. They want to overthrow the government and the Constitution, so they're probably going to try. But it's just not a big issue for them, at least right now. That's not to say it hasn't been in the past, but right now it's not something that they're really thinking a lot about. Tessa says, private property ownership. I think I remember you saying that they consider themselves to be the proletariat. Well, yes. Does that mean none of them own their homes or have small businesses? Would any of them consider themselves to be part of the bourgeois? No, none of them would consider themselves to be part of the bourgeois, but you have to understand that they are allowed to engage in capitalism as long as they're trying to overthrow it. So very few socialists I follow actually own their homes. I know that there's the big BLM scandal with them using donation money to buy homes, but you guys have got to understand that really is the exception. It's not the rule. It's kind of one of those things that muddies the water for everything else, because a lot of the socialists that I track and follow are very proud renters. Not that they believe landlords should exist, because they don't, but all the tenant right groups that you see all over the country, tenant right groups are socialists. They're radical leftists. And that the reason for that is they don't really believe landlords should exist. So a lot of them do rent. They don't want to be private property owners. That would not sit well with them. Could they do it? Yes, as long as they're using their time and their resources to try to overthrow the capitalist system. They are actually allowed to engage in capitalism. They're allowed to have businesses. They're allowed to sell stuff. They're allowed to buy property if they want to buy property. But you have to understand that this is all permissible based on the Communist Manifesto. The Communist Manifesto literally says we live in a capitalist world. You have to survive in a capitalist world. And in order to survive, you have to engage in capitalism. And as long as you're trying to overthrow the system, that's totally fine. So saying to a leftist like, oh, you bought a capitalist computer, or you have a business, or you're selling books, why are you selling books? It's not the own you guys think it is, because the leftist is going to go, well, I live in a capitalist society. I have to eat. I have to have a roof over my head. How do you want me to do that? I live in a capitalist society. So they are actually allowed to do that, but I do understand why you asked that question. Chris says, once organizations have declared that their goal is overthrowing the U.S. government, why are they not immediately declared a domestic terrorist organization and hunted down? Hey, Chris, I think that's a great question. It's not, sadly, a question that I can answer, because I am not in law enforcement and I'm not in government, and no one listens to me. So I have been showing videos of the far left talking about overthrowing the federal government for literally years. They have hundreds of thousands of views on Twitter. They've gone viral on multiple occasions. No one does anything about it. So I would love to be able to answer your question, but your question is best directed to Donald Trump and the Department of Justice and the FBI and whoever in the government is making those decisions, because that's not something I have power to do. My only job is to show up and to show you guys what's going on. And if the government wants to ignore all this because they're focused on anti-Semitism, then they're allowed to do that. And so I would direct your question there, but I appreciate that you asked it. Glow So Bright says, have you conducted research on Marxist non-state armed American factions? Most notable that exist are John Brown Gun Club, Socialist Rifle Association, Doll Squad. Yeah, so those I haven't done a ton of research into those factions, but you're right, those factions do exist. They are stockpiling weapons, they are training with weapons. Anyone that believes that the left does not own guns and that conservatives has all the guns, that is fundamentally unhinged from reality. The left is planning a violent overthrow of the government, people. I'm not joking when I say that. So yes, they have guns, and yes, we do occasionally watch them, but not all that much. John says, listening to the linkage of economics and culture seems to go beyond Marx's view of cultural flowing from economic superstructures. Has Gramsci's thought been a serious influence? So, okay, so what you have to understand, John, you're talking to me about what I call the dead philosophers. And I appreciate why you're talking about the dead philosophers, okay? So I think the mistake that a lot of people make when they're trying to study the far left is you immediately go to Marx, or you go to Hegel, or you go to Gramsci, or you go to even Foucault if you want to get into queer theory and stuff like that. You go to who I call the dead philosophers. These are people who wrote papers and manifestos, 50, 100, 200 years ago. And what you have to understand is the far left activist base, let me say that again. The far left activist base in the United States, they are not going directly based on the original documents. What's happened is what I call gain-of-function Marxism, which is that, yes, you have the original core philosophy, and yes, they do tend to read a lot of Marx, but just because Marx wrote something doesn't mean that's being applied on the far left today. Just because Gramsci wrote something doesn't mean that's being applied on the far left today. The reason I have the methodology I do with only watching leftist trainings, I don't actually read any of the philosophy unless I absolutely have to. The reason I only watch leftist trainings is I have this crazy idea that if the left is not teaching something to each other in the real world, then that thing is probably not relevant. And this is what I think a mistake that a lot of commentators make is that they go back and they find a random paper that was published in some random academic journal 50 years ago that says really crazy things. And that paper might be crazy and it might be fun to read. It doesn't mean that paper is influential on the far left. Just because Marx wrote something doesn't mean it's influential on the far left. I think today we're dealing with an ideology that has mutated. Again, this is why I call it gain-of-function Marxism. It has mutated into a weird mishmash that is not necessarily directly stemming from people like Marx and Gramsci. So I can't answer your question of like specific papers or ideas that they have because that's not how I study. I just look at the far left trainings in the real world. I look at the documents they're publishing today, and I base my ideas around what they believe based on the content that they're creating now. Any evidence of Frankfurt School influences? Yeah, we talked about that earlier in the presentation, John. Frankfurt School is definitely one of the origins of this. They set up shop at Columbia University in the 1930s, and that has become one of the epicenters for social justice activism and stuff like that. But we do focus on, what they're doing in the real world today, and no problem about the typos. I make typos all the time. Bob wants to know, Karlyn, would you please explain concepts of settler colonialism and decolonization in the rhetoric of the left in the context of higher education with demands to decolonize the curriculum? Oh, Bob, that's such an easy question. Thank you for that complicated question, Bob, that has nothing to do with any of the content I presented tonight. Okay, I'm being a little facetious. But, okay, so the idea of settler colonialism, okay, if we go back to the left wanting to abolish capitalism because they believe that capitalism is defined as private property ownership, settler colonialism is the idea of an external group coming in and stealing indigenous land and privatizing it for their exclusive use under capitalism or the bourgeois. That external group almost always tends to be European in nature. So it's like, the UK going in and creating an empire. The UK were the settler colonists in India. The United States are considered to be the settler colonists. We are considered to be the settler colonists in the United States because the settlers came in and took the land from the Native Americans and put the Native Americans on reservations, and we colonized the land in the United States. That's one of the reasons the left wants to overthrow the government and the Constitution is the United States is considered to be a settler colonial nation. Israel is considered to be a settler colonial nation. They consider Israel to be the ones that came in and stole the land of the Palestinian people, privatized it, made it exclusively for Israeli use. That is why the left is against what's going on with Israel. It's not because they're Jewish, it's because they stole the land from the Palestinians. In the context of higher education, this gets a little complicated. In the context of higher education, essentially, the left believes, so you got to remember, so the left does have a lot of power within the university system, but their power is primarily on the academic faculty side. There is another side of higher education, and I worked in higher education for about 10 years. There's another side of higher education that basically is the administration side, and the administration and the faculty fight all the time. And so when we're talking about the colonization and the decolonization of higher education, what that tends to be is the faculty and the students, who are usually radical revolutionary leftists, fighting to overthrow the capitalist demands of the institution. An example of this might be that the left is pissed off that colleges perceive the job of the college to produce future workers. So if you go to a college website and they have something like, 98% of our students get a job within 6 months of graduation, what the left would say is, you're looking at college as a way to prepare people for the workforce. You're looking at college as a way to prepare people to perpetuate the capitalist model. That's what they might mean when they're saying decolonization. It's removing capitalism from the institution. They may also say decolonize the curriculum, which is to only tell stories from the perspective of the proletariat or the oppressed, not from the oppressor point of view. This is the basis of Howard Zinn's People History of the United States. So that's kind of what they mean. I will go into that more in depth in another class or another stream, but I do appreciate you asking the question. Brian says, saw your presentation on animism. Well, that's different than this topic. Have you researched the origins of progressive social movements? Okay, I do not recommend Tick History. I'm going to be honest. So, Brian, I see you recommending Tick History in the comments. I do not recommend them. Hang on one second. Hang on. Getting a phone call, giving a presentation. We'll call you right back. Hang on. So I don't recommend Tick History. I did watch one of Tick History's videos, and honestly, I found it to be so absurd. And it sounds like it's the video you are referencing in the question, which is the video about Gnosticism. It was absurd. Maybe Tick History has some really good videos that I haven't seen, but that one was not hinged into reality at all. So no, I don't recommend that one. Reagan has a question. I have two quick questions that newbies might be thinking about when they start learning this. See, Reagan's always so helpful. Thank you, Reagan. And happy birthday. Everyone in the chat wish Reagan a happy birthday. Again, she is spending her birthday here with us trying to teach people about socialism. Reagan is a tireless warrior to try to get this content out there, and I really just appreciate her. Number one question. You see socialists with expensive laptops and engaging in capitalism. Why do they do this when they hate capitalism? Oh, and why can't they just move to a socialist place? So we kind of answered this question earlier. Socialists are allowed to have expensive laptops as long as they are doing the business of trying to overthrow the capitalist institution. Why can't socialists just move to a socialist country? Because they want to enact socialism here in the United States. They are never going to move to Venezuela. They're never going to move to Cuba. They believe that the United States needs to fall to socialism to get other countries to fall to socialism. They do want a global socialist world, essentially. Remember, the left doesn't believe in borders. Borders are private property. So they don't believe in borders. So, of course, they want socialism to be everywhere, because if socialism is everywhere, they think it has the most chance of success. So they are not going to leave to go to a new country. They want to do it in the United States, and that's part of what they're doing. Number two, aren't we dealing with a bunch of, Reagan, I love that you asked this question. Isn't the left just a bunch of losers and mentally insane people that don't have jobs? Not only do the left have jobs, the left controls all the unions. So the unions are a very big part of socialist organizing. It's not a subject we got into tonight, but the unions are a massive problem when it comes to socialist organizing. Now, not everyone in a union is a leftist, but everyone who controls the unions are leftists, and leftists utilize the unions all the time for to recruit and radicalize more people to their cause. So I appreciate you discussing that. Jane says, can you discuss the unions? I just did a little bit. Glow So Bright says, what is the common slurs used, such as calling perceived enemies Nazis, fascists, white supremacists, colonizers, and variants of crypto-Nazi? I mean, those are kind of all the words that they use. But what you have to understand, Glow So Bright, is literally all of those words are references to capitalism. So Nazis, fascists, white supremacists, colonizers, crypto-Nazis, literally all of those are references to capitalism. So I would just not pay attention when anyone calls you a name, honestly, because you just got to learn how to deflect that stuff. It doesn't matter. Victory over symbolism. Does the confusion with CRT, critical race theory, originate from the left? Well, no, critical race theory is all about studying systemic racism. So systemic racism, again, is the system that upholds racism. If you get into the woman that we saw in the presentation, Cheryl Harris, who wrote the paper Whiteness is Property, she's a critical race theorist. If you look at, she studied with Derek Bell. Derek Bell is one of the original inventors of critical race theory. And so when you're talking about critical race theory is all about understanding systemic racism in this country. Systemic racism is a reference to capitalism, because systemic racism is the institution that upholds racism. And again, anytime they're talking about whiteness within critical race theory, they're talking about capitalism. If you, again, read my book called A Brief History of Racism, I actually go through quotes from several critical race theory scholars where they're flat out saying it's capitalism, 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 capitalism over again. So that's a good resource there. Who was Gramsci? Gramsci was the originator of the idea of the long march through the institutions. So the whole idea of taking over the institutions bit by bit over the course of decades, which is exactly what the left has done. That originated with Gramsci. That's not a topic I talk about a lot. And by the way, guys, the reason I don't talk about the philosophers, it's not that I don't think the philosophers are important. I do think they're important. It's just that there are so many other people covering that. So there are a million people who've written about Gramsci. There are really millions of people who've written about Marx and Engels and Hegel and Derrida and Foucault and even Butler, although we do cover Judith Butler quite a bit because Judith Butler's alive and she's still speaking. That's why we cover her, essentially. But because there are so many people who cover the philosophy, I took a different tactic with it, which is I want to cover what the left is saying and doing in the real world right now. And so that's the tactic that I took. And you know, for better or worse. Don't know if this got asked. This is Julianne and answered yet, but it seems to be a common question. Are they going to take away my toothbrush and my dog? So yes, it did get asked, Julian. This is the reference to personal property. So when I reference that the left says, I'm not going to take away your car, I'm not going to take away your toothbrush, I'm not going to take away your dog, that is the trick that they're playing between personal property and private property, where they're going to tell you, we don't want your personal property, we just want to take away the bourgeois property. Well, the bourgeois property means your ability to own a home, your ability to own land, your ability to own an apartment rental, your parental rights over your kids, all that stuff that we talked about earlier. So that does seem to be critical resource theory. I don't know what critical resource theory is, victory over symbolism. I've never heard the left talk about that. But I do know critical race theory, which is how I frame that question. All right. That's it, guys. That's all we have for Q&A. Thank you again for coming out for the live presentation. If I answered your question too quickly, or if you didn't get get a full explanation, or you're still a little bit confused, please do let me know. You can always contact me, DM me on Substack, DM me on Twitter. You can always come into the chats on my live stream and ask questions there. I highly encourage questions. What we covered tonight is literally just the tip of the iceberg. This is just an intro course. And so if you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed, that's perfectly normal, but just know there's a lot more to learn and I will do my very best to teach it to you. So thank you guys for coming out. I really do appreciate it. And I will see you over on the Substacks or the YouTubes or the Twitters. And if you can support the work I'm doing, please consider doing so. Again, becoming a member on my main Substack is the #1 way to do it. You can also make a one-time gift on decodetheleft.com/support and just keep showing up. And if you can't afford to financially support my work, share it out. Get it in front of as many people as possible. I would really appreciate it. All right, guys, that's all I've got. Take care, and we'll see you next time.